Hi y'all, Biohack here. It finally happened, or I should say is happening. Prolibus has announced that they are bringing the update to the silver value of Cron stones to North America and the costume price increase. So, a little bummed about this, but I figured I would bring it to your attention that it is coming to North America in case you missed the update, and we'll also talk about the changes because they are a little different than what they ended up doing on KR. But yeah, so anyway, they put this post on the website earlier today, just basically talking about, that they're making this update. They kind of show this graph here where they talk about the increase in the amount of silver per day that players are earning, and they're using this as a justification to increase the value of the cron stones from the vendor. Now, of course, as I talked about at length in the video I did when they first announced that this change was happening on KR, I think that this is very silly. This is a silly way to look at this. This is the game's catch-up mechanic. Inflation is the way that BDO remains accessible for new players. You make more money per day now than you did 4 years ago. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how people coming into the game now can catch up to the people who've been playing for 7 years, like people like me. The fact that they're using this as a justification for the Cronstone price increase makes no sense to me, because if you don't want silver, if you don't want inflation to happen in the game, then just don't put inflation in the game. Like, they are intentionally designing the game to have inflation in it. They don't need to do that. There is no like, if they don't want it there, don't put it there. But the fact of the matter is it's a good thing. We do want it there because it's serving as the catch-up mechanic, like I mentioned. So this whole justification for increasing the Cron price is just nonsense, and as far as I'm concerned, it is interesting to actually see what these numbers look like, to see that, oh, we are making about 600% more than we were in 2019, which tracks with what I would kind of guess. I think I had suggested it was maybe like a 50% increase a year, which would be, it's a little under that, but yeah, no, not too bad. Anyway, that's their justification, and that's the logic. Okay, so let's dig into the details of what they're actually changing. So they have a breakdown of basically the amount of crons that you're going to get per costume and how much the costumes are going to cost. And they're increasing the amount of costumes or crons you get for a costume by about 60%. And they're increasing the value by about 94%. So this is not as bad as it was on KR. On KR, they changed it from okay, so let's talk about what this means. First off, if we look at how much silver you're going to have to pay to get a costume cron in the old method versus the new method, it's about 1.352 million silver per cron stone if you bought costumes before the change. After the change, it's about 1.65. In contrast, in KR, after their update, this is kind of what their number was before, and then they got their next update, which raised it to 2.2 million silver per cron when you get it from the costume. So from a costume perspective, it's not that bad. Honestly, if they had only done this change, I actually would be okay with it, because this is just kind of bringing us in line with where it was with KR. And I think it's fine if vendor crons are 2 million silver, because it makes that gap between vendor and costume lower. So, yes, it's a little bit of a reverse catch-up mechanic, making it harder for new players to catch up, but it brings the servers more in line. Of course, that's not the whole story, because they're also increasing the vendor crons from 2 million to 3 million silver. So this is actually pretty nuts, because this means that the ratio difference, or like the silver difference between vendor crons and costume crons, is the worst it's ever been in the game. It's now over 1.3 million silver, 1.35 million silver more expensive to buy a vendor cron than a costume cron. That's flat out the highest it's ever been in the history of the game, in terms of an absolute silver value. Even in terms of a percentage, it's still pretty high. It's not quite double, but it's pretty close to double the vendor cron. So this is a big bummer for people who play on EU and other regions where you can't get costumes. I'm not sure. I didn't check all the other regions to see if they're getting the same numbers. I think a few different regions had their numbers posted, and if I recall correctly, all the ones I saw were exactly the same as this. So those regions, it's going to be rough. But if you don't play on a region where you can't get costumes, it's going to be it's going to be pretty brutal in terms of how much more it's going to be to get them with vendor crons versus costume crons. So it's a big rip for EU players in particular. I know people are going to complain about that a lot, and it's going to further increase the gap between North America and some of the other regions in terms of how easy it is to gear up, because it's a pretty modest increase in the price of vendor crons or costume crons, but it's a major increase in terms of vendor. So I went ahead and made this little spreadsheet here. I'm going to pull it up, that just basically looks at a couple of different items in the game that are very popular to use cron stones on, and some kind of like recommended stacks you might click those on, how many crons you're going to need. I didn't spell that correctly. And then looking at basically what the price change is going to be. So the first one that comes to the list is Pen Blackstar. This is probably like one of the biggest cron sucks in the game for new players. It's one of the first big items you go for that needs cron stones. If you use a 240 stack on a Pen Blackstar, you need about 73,400 cron stones to get one. So in the old system, that was about 99 billion silver worth of cron stones. In the new costume crons, it's going to be about 120. So the total works out to about 21.4 billion if we look at the specific numbers, which is an increase, but it's not too bad. I mean, it's not even a 20% increase. But if we start looking at vendor crons, that's where we see a massive difference. So if we use vendor crons in the past, it was about 147 billion, goes up to 220 billion silver to make a Pen Blackstar using vendor crons. That's an increase of 73.4 billion, which is pretty huge, especially since you can buy a Pen Blackstar on NA right now for like 120 bill. So this is massive. That being said, like the reality is that you probably just don't want to make a Pen Blackstar on EU. If you're being a smart, efficient player, you probably should just buy one. Do not try and craft one. This might be cheaper to raw click. It depends on what the value of tets are than pens and stuff. So it's a little nuanced there, but it might be cheaper to actually raw click than it would be to use vendor crons on EU. But I think you can probably just buy one cheaper than this. But of course, if everyone starts doing that, eventually they'll be sold out, even if they're selling at 200 bill, because just the cron stones alone to make a pen on EU are going to be significantly higher than the 200 bill cap on the market. So that's pretty brutal for those guys. NA, not too bad. I wouldn't expect a major change, but EU and other regions with sold out costumes, it's going to be rough. And now the other thing is because we didn't get the huge change in the cron price that KR got, where it went all the way up to like 2.2 million from the vendor crons, or for the costume crons. Costume crons are still significantly cheaper than vendor crons. That's part of like what I was talking about a minute ago with the biggest gap ever, which means we're probably not going to see costumes sit in large quantities like they're seeing in KR, because they're not as inefficient to use costume crons as it was in the past, or as it was on KR. Like it's still pretty good to use costume crons, and they're only 1.6 mil. So you might see some sitting in the short term, but I wouldn't count on costumes sitting on the long term on EU. Even on NA, they might sit in the short term. I'm sure they'll sit in the short term for a bit, but in the long run, I don't think they'll probably sit. At least unless we get the same ratio that KR has, because they're still significantly cheaper than the costume or than the vendor price, and because they're lower in price apps overall, they're a little more viable to use on some other things. So, okay, some of the other things we have on the list, we have a Tri Fallen God. If we're using a 200 stack to make that and we're cronning it, we're looking at about 20,000 cron stones, which means an increase of about 5.8 billion silver to take the duo to the Tri, using costume crons before and after. Using vendor crons, we're looking at about a 20 billion silver increase, which is actually a pretty meaningful amount for the Tribe falling. Again, it's just these vendor cron increases are pretty brutal. For Tet, it's even worse. If we look at using a 240 stack, it's about 54,000 cron stones. If we use old costume versus new costumes, that's about a 15.7 billion silver increase versus a 54 billion silver increase. So if we're using vendor crons, so you can expect, especially if you're on a region where costumes are difficult to get, that the fallen gods are going to get a lot more expensive on the market. This is a pretty massive increase for vendor, with again the same story for for costumes being minor, but not too bad. Debarekas at Tet. These actually don't use a ton of Cron stones. I kind of talked about that in the video about making Tet Debarekas. If you're curious at exactly what stacks, this is the total cost to make a Tet from scratch. So if you want to see exactly what stacks to use and how to make Debarekas, check out my Debareka enhancing video for that. But we can see that for a Tet, the vendor Cron change is only about 3.7 billion, which for an item that sells for 99 billion is pretty minor. The reality is that the Cron stones are just not that big a deal when we're talking about Tet Debarekas. Even the vendor Cron change is definitely way more significant. It's a 12.7 instead of a 3.7 increase. So that is meaningful, but compared to the total value of the item of about 100 bill, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's okay. You can still definitely make those things with vendor Crons and sell them, and it'll be decent, especially if they sell at 99 bill. I don't even think they are selling at 99 bill on EU. I think they're actually kind of sitting. I heard they crashed some, like, maybe it was belts or necklaces, crashed all the way to, like, back to, like, 60 billion or something like that. But, you know, so expect the price to go up a little bit on those because it will be more expensive. But it's really when we start looking at the pen Debarekas that we start to see a major increase in price. So if we use, I think I recommended like a 270 stack or something like that for the pen portion. But we got 124,203 Cron stones. Let me fix these numbers real quick. But that basically translates into a 36.3, give or take, billion silver increase in the price of pen, which is bad, but, you know, for an item as difficult and as expensive as a pen Debareka, an extra 36 billion is annoying, but not the end of the world. But again, when we start talking about vendor Crons, it's brutal. 124 billion silver more expensive to make a pen Debareka with vendor Crons after the change. So yeah, I mean, this sucks, to be honest. I think Pearl Abyss was going in a really good direction as they were changing that ratio to make it more even between the servers. I think that was great. And this is just, it's a bunch of bad news. It's a major step back for all the servers that don't get access to costumes because they're always sold out. I don't think the increase in the price of costumes is going to create enough sales to make them sit around long term. So I don't think you're just going to be able to use costume Crons. I could be wrong, but I kind of doubt it because, you know, they're still way cheaper than vendor Crons. That 1.6 change, or 1.65 versus the 2.25, makes a big difference in terms of how likely you are going to want to Cron something when we compare like the NA Cron price, costume Cron price, to the KR costume Cron price. So yeah, I don't know. That is what it is. I doubt Pearl Abyss is going to change their mind on this. I don't know how I don't know if this is better or worse than the KR change. I'm kind of leaning towards maybe even a little worse. It's nice that the new players on NA aren't going to get as screwed as they would have been if we got the full costume Cron price increase. So that's one benefit, but the players on every other server are getting super screwed. So I don't know, and we're gonna have big gaps between regions, which I don't know. It's just, yeah, it's not ideal. Okay, so that's gonna be it for this video. Please subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content, and I don't know, maybe if we make us think about this, Pearl Abyss will change it, but I don't have my high hopes. So I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.